So now that we've set the stage and shown how the presence of O2 and other elements greatly impacts the growth of the biosphere, we face two key questions about our living Earth system. What makes life different from non-living things? And why are there so many different types of living things? When we ask that first question about the characteristics of life, we are forced to admit that there is no one simple, easy test that can be used to answer the first question completely. Simply put, life is notoriously difficult to define. In fact, there are in-between cases that have some, but not all, of the characteristics associated with life. Each of the items shown on this screen, from one point of view, could be said to be alive, but from another point of view, might not be said to be alive. It's tricky. That said, here's a list to consider. Organisms are made of cells. That's true whether we're talking about prokaryotes or eukaryotes. Prokaryote, shown in green, is like the bacteria, relatively small, and its interior isn't terribly complex. In comparison to the eukaryote, shown in purple, animal and plant cells like this are much larger, and they have a lot more going on inside. This complexity extends to the fact that they have a nucleus, and they also have membrane-bound structures called organelles, the little organs of the cell. And we'll learn more about that in future lessons. But organisms are made of cells. Organisms respond to stimuli. A stimulus is anything that causes you to respond in some way. Even simple bacteria, prokaryotes, will respond to a stimulus. If you put a bacteria next to light, it often will choose to move towards the light source. Or if you have a big puddle of water and bacteria on one side and you put an interesting chemical to them on the other side, they may very well move to what's stimulating them. Organisms are made of cells and they respond to stimuli. Organisms use and obtain energy. Here, the leaf of a plant is obtaining energy from the sunlight. It uses this energy to drive the reactions of photosynthesis while the sun is shining. And 24/7, both day and night, it does cellular respirations with the products of photosynthesis. So organisms, just like plants, they use and obtain energy. Organisms must reproduce. Many organisms, relatively simple, often simply copy themselves and divide. We call that asexual reproduction. Other organisms are members of species that have two sexes, male and female, and males and females will collaborate. Genes will be exchanged in making a new organism. But whether we're talking about asexual reproduction like bacteria or sexual reproduction like most animals, all organisms reproduce. To reproduce, organisms must use a genetic code. Most organisms use DNA, and we'll learn more about that later. But there are a few organisms, and there certainly are viruses that will use RNA exclusively. Organisms are members of populations, which have the ability to evolve. The individuals don't change, but the organisms are able to be part of a population which undergoes genetic change. Remember, we learned about the finches and the Galapagos and how, under certain situations, as the environment changed, some organisms did better and some organisms did worse at the business of survival and reproduction. Now, this may all seem cut and dried. Surely, if everything meets all the check points that we're talking about, you've got a living thing. If you don't, well, you don't. Well, there are in-between cases. In this illustration, we see that viruses and bacteria, they both cause disease, and they both contain DNA and enzymes. But the thing is, a virus is a crystal rather than a cell. A virus does not respond to stimulus. A virus does not use or obtain energy. And a virus, surprisingly, can't reproduce on its own. It can't do any of these things. Instead, a virus must hijack the machinery of some host cell in effect in order to make copies of itself. So from that point of view, it would seem like a virus isn't alive. But viruses do occur in populations, and those populations do use a genetic code. And due to random mutation, those populations of viruses do have the ability to evolve. So, is a virus alive or not? It depends on how you look at it. There is no easy, obvious answer. When we turn to the second question, we're on a bit more certain ground, but it is more complex as well. Why are there so many different kinds of living things? This second question is very important. Here we have a metaphorical tree. It's not a real tree. We're not saying it's an actual tree that does this, it produces the organisms, of course. But we will often use the image of a tree when we talk about the relationship between different organisms. In biology, diversity is real, it's measurable, it's a property of biological systems, and it's really very simple. Diversity refers to the number of different kinds of living things. The more number of living things, the more different kinds of living things you have living in a particular environment, the more diverse it is. Now, if we want to measure diversity, we have to be able to tell the different kinds of organisms apart. So it's necessarily true that to measure diversity, scientists must classify the various organisms. But this presents a problem for us because the scope of what we're talking about is difficult to grasp. How much diversity are we talking about? From Earth orbit, we can't see any direct evidence of individual living things, but as we dive down beneath the clouds, perhaps beneath the waves, we start to see more and more different kinds of living things, and it awakens our sensibilities to what is possible. How many different kinds of living things are there? Cnidarians, birds, fish. How many different kinds of living things are there? It's an interesting question. There's all kinds of different environments on Earth, and due to natural selection, different environments tend to create populations that are well adapted to those environments, whether it's the Arctic of these emperor penguins, or the African savanna of these cheetahs and giraffes, or the desert for these camels. Organisms aren't just animals, they could be plants, they could be fungi. There's just an astonishing diversity, and there's an astonishing number of different kinds of living things. Whether it's elephants on the savanna, or corals in the reef, mammals on the water or mammals on land, plants growing at different rates over time, forest of mangroves, coral atolls. Living things shape the environment, and the environment shapes living things, and so this back and forth leads to constant adjustment of populations here on Earth. Why are there so many different kinds of living things? Well, because there's so many different kinds of environments on Earth and so many different kinds of challenges to respond to through the process of natural selection. Mammals, fungi, plants, fish, protists, birds, reptiles, amphibians, insects. We have to see our planet as an endless well of diversity. So that points out the size of the problem. There's just a lot of different kinds of living things. In fact, there's plenty of species of living things that have not yet been described. We suspect that the majority of living things on Earth have not yet been described and named. And so the branch of biology that's concerned with classifying organisms is called taxonomy. Traditionally, taxonomy has been based on differences in form, what living things look like from the outside, what we say is their morphology. But in the modern world, taxonomy is now being reorganized on the basis of complex new data from molecular biology. This data is remarkable. Here we consider a data set which looks like a whole bunch of trees stuck together but rearranged into a circle, with every part of the circle pointing toward the center. We zoom in on the outside of this tree, we see a shape that reminds us of ourselves. The red man is a hominid, and next to the red man, well, we have a lot of other creatures with different labels, and these are all primates. If we ascend, on this wheel, we see many bats, we see toothed whales, artiodactyls, perissodactyls, various kinds of both marine mammals and land mammals. As we go along the top of the wheel, we see carnivores of various types, including marine mammals. As we descend here, we see the marsupials, hares and rabbits, a very large number of rodents, And eventually this leads us back to the bottom of the wheel. There's a lot of different things in this wheel, but in fact, there's more than this diagram will do justice. Let's do the math. Over 2,200 species of rodents, 109 lagomorphs, which is hares and rabbits, 334 marsupials, 279 carnivores, 280 ungulates, 94 cetaceans, marine mammals, 1,400 bats, 486 Uapoltyphloids, and then 505 primates. Now we see all the branching in detail. Toward the end of the 20th century, it was estimated that there were around 6,400 living species on this particular data set. But that doesn't mean 6,400 species of, organisms. It doesn't mean 6,400 species of animals. This is 6,400 species just of the mammals, the group that includes human beings. There were about 6,400 different species of mammals at the end of the 20th century. Well, this is all very complicated. Since we're just beginning to study taxonomy, we'll use a simpler system to keep track of all this diversity. Kings play chess on fine green sand. King stands for kingdom, play for phylum, chess for class, on for order, fine for family, green for genus, and sand for species. Kings play chess on fine green sand. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Now, if we take all of that into account, there's a generic term for all these terms like phylum, class, and order. The generic term for all these levels of classification is taxon. And if we're going to talk about more than one taxon, the plural is taxa. These are very convenient terms to use when you're talking about more than one level of classification. Taxon, and the plural is taxa. Now, these different taxa can be arranged in a hierarchical pyramid like the ones we've seen before. But watch out. This doesn't mean that one type of organism is higher or lower than another. It's just a convenient way to arrange them. Come up with all of these taxa, all these levels of classification. Well, it all began with a Swedish scientist named Carl von Linné, who's often better known by the Latin version of his name, Linnaeus. Linnaeus was probably the last person who could say with some confidence that he knew the names of most of the living things on Earth because he named them himself. Beginning in 1735, Linnaeus published a book in 2 volumes called Systemae Naturae, which simply means the system of nature. In it, he introduced a concept called binomial nomenclature. Binomial means two named, nomenclature means naming system. Very fancy, but it just means that we're going to have a naming system that includes 2 names, like a first name and a last name. Linnaeus' special stroke of genius was to create a system that was written in Latin, which was a dead language that, since it didn't belong to any living people, belonged equally to everyone. The reason why you might want a special language to name species may not be obvious, but consider this. Every country has its own language, and therefore every country is likely to have its own names for different kinds of organisms. And not every common name that's given is useful. For example, we have a jellyfish, we have a starfish, and we have a crayfish. These are 3 different organisms that all live in the ocean. They're all marine organisms, and so they were all dubbed fish. But from our point of view, that's not a good idea because they aren't all fish. A jellyfish isn't a fish, it's a cnidarian. A starfish isn't a fish, it's an echinoderm. And a crayfish isn't a fish, it's an arthropod, specifically a crustacean. Here's another puzzle. There's a certain organism that most students are very familiar with. If they see it, they know what to call it, or at least they think they do. Some people call this thing an armadillo bug, or a woodlouse, or a cheese log, or a pill bug, or a chucky pig, or a doodle bug. Well, what's in a name? In Linnaeus' system, we don't use any of these common names, even though they're all in English and they all sound pretty interesting. Instead, we use a two-word phrase that's in Latin. Porcellio is the first name, it's the genus. The scaber is the second name, it's like the species name. And Porcellio scaber, it turns out, isn't a bug at all. Many students are surprised to learn that this creature, which they might call a roly-poly, is in fact not an insect at all. It's actually a crustacean that lives on land. It's more closely related to crabs and lobsters than it ever will be to an insect. Now, to classify organisms, it's often helpful to use a dichotomous key. This is just a device that's based on a simple principle. Does the organism have this or that trait? If the answer is yes, you go one way. If the answer is no, you go in a different way. A dichotomy is two mutually exclusive possibilities. Here we have a pair of Venn diagrams. For the one on the right, the diagram for A and the diagram for B overlap. They are not mutually exclusive. It's possible to be A and B at the same time. But the diagram on the left, this Venn diagram, shows mutually exclusive events. Two circles, one A and one B. You're either A or you're B, but you're not both. A dichotomous key functions like the diagram on the left. It's like you're going down the road and it suddenly goes off in two different directions. You can't go down both directions at the same time. You have to make a choice. A dichotomous key is like a fork in the road. A dichotomous key often produces a branching pattern, which is similar to what is seen in nature. We don't use shapes that look like trees because we're trying to be cute. We're using a branching pattern like a tree because that's actually what seems to occur in nature. Here we have a sample dichotomous key. We're going to begin by looking at the first box, which we'll just label organisms. And now we ask a real basic question. Does this organism have 6 legs? There's only 2 possibilities. Either yes, it has 6 legs, or no, it does not have 6 legs. Let's suppose our answer is that the organism has 6 legs. We can now ask another question. Does it have antennae or not? Now, in a realistic dichotomous key, we would be talking about the type of antennae. As you can see, there's many different shapes of antennae. But let's just pretend that that's not important, and the only question that matters is, do you have it or not? So if you don't have any antennae, you'd go one way, but if you have antennae, you would go another. Does this organism with 6 legs and antennae, does it have large hind legs for hopping? Or does it not have large hind legs? Did you guess that this was the type of organism that we would be describing? Is this a mental picture that might be true for an organism that did not have those large hind legs? Sure, for a simple sample key like this to demonstrate the principle, we end up with a very neat cut and dried kind of answer. You know, one way we get a grasshopper and the other way we get an ant. I hope you won't be surprised when I tell you that real dichotomous keys ask much more particular questions in much more careful ways, and they end up providing a lot more detail in attempting to distinguish and identify organisms. For example, we might place the green creature in an order of insects called Orthoptera, which includes grasshoppers, but it also includes crickets and other things that fit that description. And we might very well put an ant in order Hymenoptera, but we would put other things in there as well, bees and social wasp and a variety of other things. For many years, living things were grouped into 4 or 5 kingdoms. Biologists still use these terms, but analysis of molecular data has led them to arrange them into 3 separate domains: bacteria, archaea, eukarya. The first branch of this phylogenetic tree is bacteria. Bacteria is sometimes called the eubacteria, which means the true bacteria. Bacteria are unicellular prokaryotes. That means they're single-celled creatures without a cell nucleus. Bacteria have cell walls with a combination, a mixture of sugars and the building blocks of protein called a peptidoglycan. And bacteria can do cellular respiration to use energy. Respiration can either be aerobic, which means it requires oxygen, or it can be some other process which is anaerobic and does not require oxygen. Our second domain in red is the archaea. The archaea, rather surprisingly, are also a kind of bacteria. The name archaea is short for archaebacteria, but it also means the old ones. Archaea, like bacteria, are also unicellular prokaryotes. Their differences are not obvious by just looking at pictures of cells from the outside. You have to look at their behavior and the environments they occupy to understand how stunningly different they are from the other prokaryotes. Their distinguishing characteristic is that they have cell walls that do not use that mixture of sugar and protein called peptidoglycan. It's made of a sterner material that's able to tolerate more difficult environments. And so these archaea are often extremophiles. They are able to survive in extreme environments. On the screen, the rainbow-colored circle you see is actually an aerial shot of a landmark at Yellowstone National Park. This is the Grand Prismatic Spring, and it is a hot spring fed by heat from the interior of the Earth. You see the steam rising from the geysers and bubbling hot pools that are nearby. And so this water is quite warm most of the year. It's getting close to the boiling point without boiling. And there are bacteria that can actually tolerate this high heat. And these kinds of bacteria, the archaea, were first discovered in this location at Grand Prismatic Spring. It's not just that they can tolerate temperatures near the boiling point of water. That's where they like to live. If you lower it to our body temperature, they don't do so well. They need a higher body temperature to survive. If that sounds strange and unbelievable that a creature could live near the boiling point of water, consider this. There are undersea volcanoes erupting on the ocean floor, 9, 10, 12,000 feet below the surface. And you can see this chimney called a black smoker. It is sending out material from the crust of the earth, and it's releasing this material into the water on the ocean floor. This is an undersea volcano. But notice on the top, where the vent, near where the gases are coming out, you see this white crusty material. That white crusty material is actually bacteria. And these bacteria can not only tolerate the water, which is very hot, but it's also super acidic because of all the minerals being released from the water right there. And it's also under crushing pressure because it's 9 to 10,000 feet below the surface of the ocean. This is an extremely hostile environment to people like you and me. The water is above the boiling point. It is under a pressure that would crush us flat. And it is so acidic, it would tear the skin off our bones. And yet somehow, these bacteria are able to tolerate all of these gruesome conditions. These are conditions that are very much like those that were present on the early Earth when the crust was still cooling. And it makes you think about what may or may not be possible in terms of life being able to emerge in such a hostile world. Since archaea were discovered only in the last 40 years, in the earlier five kingdom system, they were put in the same group, a kingdom called Monera. We don't actually use that five kingdom system anymore, but for a long time, all the bacteria were lumped in Monera. Molecular data, however, has proven that they are on a completely different branch. Now, all this talk of bacteria, I mean, 2 of the 3 domains are all single-celled creatures, and that's all well and good, but we're actually, of course, interested in creatures that might be multicellular, that might be made of many cells, things that we could see with the naked eye, creatures like ourselves. And so this is domain eukarya. In the modern system, this 3rd domain, eukarya, is arranged into 4 kingdoms. And all of these kingdoms are eukaryotic. All these kingdoms are eukaryotic, composed of cells with a nucleus. Protista, Plantae, fungi, Animalia. Is very diverse. Most of the organisms are unicellular, but some, like the giant kelp, Macrocystis, are very large indeed, made of many cells. They are very diverse. Some protists are autotrophs, like plants. They're able to do photosynthesis or chemosynthesis and make their own food, self-feeders. Whereas other protists are heterotrophs. They have to consume other organisms to survive. They are other feeders. So in general, this is the most diverse of the kingdoms within domain eukarya, and it's not always clear where things belong. The bottom line is, if they can't figure out any other place to put you, they put you in kingdom Protista. Kingdom Plantae, of course, is the plants. It's multicellular, made of more than one cell. They're autotrophs, able to make their own food. And their cells have an additional layer called a cell wall. And the cell wall of plants is made of a digestible kind of sugar called cellulose. Plants, for the most part, don't move around once they're rooted in the soil, and so we say they are non-motile. Things like purple mushrooms are also plants, but actually this is kingdom fungi. They are multicellular like the plants, but they don't make their own food. Instead, they're heterotrophs who get their nutrition by breaking down organic matter. We say that they are decomposers. Instead of having cell walls made of cellulose, their cell walls are made of chitin. And just like plants, they tend not to move around. They are non-motile. Finally, we have kingdom Animalia. We're multicellular, and we are heterotrophs. We have to consume other organisms to get our nutrition. Our cells don't have the extra layer of protection of a cell wall, and the reason we don't is because cell walls make us rigid, and we don't want to be rigid because most animals move around. They are motile. Now, there are exceptions like corals who, in their adult stage, almost look like plants or clumps of rock, but they're actually animals. They share more genes in common with us than with plants, fungi, or any other sort of thing. So we have corals and echinoderms, mollusks and cnidarians, arthropods and arachnids, hexapods, that's the insects, fish and amphibians, jellyfish aren't fish, but they are cnidarians. Reptiles, birds, and of course mammals, that group of 6,400 or so species that includes human beings. This is all a lot of vocabulary, so to finish off your study guide, we're going to expect you to define the following terms: autotroph, heterotroph, consumer, producer, prokaryote, eukaryote, taxon, unicellular, and multicellular. You'll notice that a lot of these words occur in pairs that either mean similar things or mean opposites, and that will help you in terms of defining them and telling me whether or not that term applies to this or that domain or kingdom. Best of luck to you in completing your study guide.